Hello and welcome to the Manitoba Grazing Club's YouTube channel. My name's Michael Thiele, Grazing Club Coordinator. During the winter of 2021, we're planning to do a number of webinars, just given our current situation with pandemic. Go to the YouTube channel, check out the other webinars. We have a few up and it's some pretty good stuff. Today, we have with us Professor Emeritus Dr. Fred Provenza. He worked in the Department of Wildland Resources, Utah State University, and we're very glad to have him here today. This has been a little bit in the works, so it's great to finally get a start on this. Fred and his wife Sue retired to an acreage near Ennis, Montana. So he seems far from retired, as he's busy writing and researching, as well as generously giving his time to do many webinars for different organizations. So we're definitely glad to have him with us to help out with Manitoba Grazing Clubs. So Fred spent a lifetime understanding and researching the interactions of animals and landscapes. And I had the pleasure to read his book, Nourishment, a couple of years ago, and I've reviewed it many times. And again, I looked through it real quick, some of the important themes, putting this together with Fred over the past year or so. It's subtitled, so Nourishment, subtitled, What Animals Can Teach Us About Rediscovering Our Nutritional Wisdom. And, you know, like I said, wonderful book. It's like a deep meditation on plants and animals and landscapes and philosophy and what it means to be human and much more. An example quote from the book that I think is profound. The quote is, "Eating is participating in endless transformations as plants and animals are grown, killed, cooked, and consumed. Every act of eating is an act of creating." I highly recommend the book. Another thing I just want to mention is a paper, and Fred was generous to share it with me, a paper that Fred co-wrote, titled "We Are the Earth and the Earth is Us, Linking Landscapes, Foodscapes, Heartscapes, and Mindscapes." And, you know, a quick summary of the paper, and Fred can add a little bit or correct my interpretation, but simply, to me, it's how we manage landscapes and conduct agriculture reflects our understanding of the land and of ecology, and that there are consequences to that, to our food, our hearts, and our minds. And it's to say simply that everything is interconnected. Today, we're beginning what we plan a series of webinars with Dr. Provenza, and we split them into 6 themes. They are the only constant, transformation, let feed be thy medicine, palates link animals with landscapes, hijacking the wisdom body, and let food be our medicine. And we're hoping that each section can be a nice bite-sized piece, approximately 30 minutes or so. And Fred will maybe add a little more context to that, and then we'll get started with part 1.
Well, Michael, it's indeed for sure a pleasure to be here with you in the Manitoba Grazing Club. Since you first corresponded with me back in 2019, I've so enjoyed our interactions, and I'm glad that we're finally getting a chance to put this together, huh? So we'll give it a good shot, and hopefully it'll be worthwhile for all the folks that would care to listen to this. So didn't know for sure what to pick as a title for this. Could have been Nourishing the Wisdom of the Body, or How Palates Link Animals with Landscapes, and so forth. But you'll get the flavor of what we're trying to do, and it is about our relationship with landscapes, as Michael says, and with one another and the landscapes that we inhabit. Our idea is to simply use these different topics, as Michael said, all related to how palates link animals with landscapes. And we want to start today with this idea of the only constant. And it may seem, you know, why would you do that? And we're going to talk about change and the importance of change. But as Michael and I talked about this and thought about it, it's the one idea that'll run through all of the different topics, this idea of change and the constancy of change. So we'll begin there today just to try to set a context on this. Then we'll move into this topic of let feed be thy medicine, which is really, there's three facets to this wisdom of the body that we'll discuss: the availability of alternative foods, mother as a transgenerational link to landscapes, and then these biochemically mediated feedbacks that really enable the wisdom of the body. But all three of these are important. And this topic of let feed be thy medicine will really introduce all three of those topics, but primarily focused on livestock and the animals in our care and what that means to help them to be healthy in landscapes and to help us not only be healthy, but also to be more profitable. Then we'll move from that one to let food be our medicine, where we'll talk more about human beings and our relationship with our animals and with the foods we eat, and how that relationship has changed over the years, and how, in fact, that relationship has been hijacked, which will be the fourth topic that we'll want to talk about. We will argue, I'll argue, and I think Michael agrees, that humans do still have wisdom to our bodies, even though, a lot of people would say, well, how can that be possible? Look at the obesity crisis, all these diet-related diseases. We're going to argue, starting with let feed be thy medicine, that we do still possess that wisdom of the body, but that it's been hijacked. And we'll get into the many ways that that's been hijacked as a way to think about, well, how can we create healthful food systems for the animals in our care and for us as well? And then we'll end on this idea of transformation. And when I think of transformation nowadays, I think about some of the last talks I gave before the pandemic hit, and the number of psychologists that were there at those conferences giving talks, because the amount of people that are suffering from depression and suicide and anxiety, and this idea of transformation and how that links with change is a way that we can bring this full circle and simply talk about some of the ways that people are hurting nowadays, and then have that linked with these other topics. So that's basically where we'll go, as I would see it. Michael, any thoughts that you want to add to that, or is that?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and my job will be to try to interject the odd question and try to make it practical, so that producers watching this at the end of each webinar can take something away that they can go and implement on their farm to make their farm better. So I guess that's our big sort of overarching goal, is to help farmers become better stewards of the land.
Perfect. We're on the same page. And as I said before we got on the air, I welcome any questions or comments you have as we go along, Michael. So let's start on this idea of the only constant. And if you think about it, the only constant in life is change. The world is constantly changing, and yet we oftentimes regard change as anomalous, a kind of a transitory disruption in a normally constant world. I used to read a lot in the physics literature, and I came to realize that even people as bright as Albert Einstein were reluctant to accept change. When he introduced what's called the cosmological constant into the general theory of relativity, what that amounted to was a refusal to accept change as the guiding principle structuring the evolution of the universe. And it was, as he later recounted, the greatest blunder of his career. Rather than accepting the universe as expanding, as constantly expanding, he saw it as fixed up until that point. On Earth, floods, fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and droughts are striking all the time. They seem to be doing so with increasing intensity and frequency. When great volcanoes like Mount St. Helens years ago erupts, knocking down trees, covering the earth with a layer of volcanic ash for miles around, we think how strange it is that nature should misbehave so. It is, we tell ourselves, a momentary lapse, kind of a geological tantrum. Soon our old planet will regain its composure, its sameness. But the truth is, it's only our short tenure on Earth that deludes us. Our time here is too short to see continents crash together and tear apart. Mountain ranges rise and fall. Vast oceans become deserts. Climates warming and cooling endlessly. And plants and animal species coming and going like the ever-changing colors and shapes of a kaleidoscope. Change then isn't the exception to the rule, it's the only rule. Any individual, any social group, any species, if it's going to survive on this planet for long, has got to be able to not only cope with change, but from a human standpoint, to embrace it, to see it as something that's an interesting challenge to be embraced, not something to be fought against, basically. And so much of what I'll have to say as we go along will relate to that idea of for all of us, how can we learn to embrace a changing world and see it as interesting challenges and opportunities? So if we look at then whether it's companies, businesses, or civilizations, or different species of plants and animals, how long do they last? How long are they here on Earth? You might, when I'm giving a talk like this in person, I'd stop here and have people say, well, how long is the average lifetime of a Fortune 500 company? How long do civilizations last? How long do species last? And it's interesting to get into a dialogue of that. Since we can't let's do it that way, let me just launch in with companies. You know, you may or may not be surprised to know that the average lifetime of an S&P 500 company here in the US shrank by over 50 years in the last century, from 67 years in the 1920s to just 15 years today. And Michael, I think that relates to a point that you made prior to going on the air here, that the rate of change is so fast now, so rapid. It's hard to keep track of all that. Small businesses, less than 10 years before they go extinct or morph into something else. Any thoughts, Michael?
Well, yeah, so I guess I want to think about this in the context of, say, an average, say, mixed farm in Manitoba is, knowing this, embrace the idea, but how do you sort of implement that at a real world level, understanding, changes the context, but, we are fearful of change, and it's nice to kind of lock in a management strategy and just repeat it for the next 50 years.
No, that's absolutely the case. I think back to one of the books I read when I was at Utah State University. I wasn't in the business department at all, but this book was written by a man who worked with the best companies in the United States over his lifetime. His name is Peter Senge, and his book is The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. And that book was about the practice of how, all these companies are going extinct rapidly. And he pointed out in his book, the average lifetime of a Fortune 500 company, the best run companies in the US, are less than half our lifetime. So the point of the book was, what do those companies do that stay in the game for the long haul? How do they do that? And he's got these 5 disciplines that he talks about. And, you might think it has to do with how well you run your business and, how well you can plow a field or what, the details. It wasn't at all about that. It was about these disciplines that have to do with developing the person, the individual, self-mastery of the individual, how we learn to work together with other people that are involved in our farm or with us and in communities. It was a very, very practical book in the end, although it was, it took some thinking. It was a thought-provoking book, but it was really, that book is about your question and how do outfits that stay in the game, whether it's a small business or a Fortune 500 company, how do they do that? What are the disciplines? So I would highly recommend for people who are interested in that his book, The Fifth Discipline. It came out many, many years ago, but I think it's as relevant today as it ever was.
All right, well, that's a good comment. Something I was just thinking was, if you think about that in the context of the family farm here in Manitoba, I'm not sure, say in the States or Montana where you're from, but if a family farm survives 100 years, you get a sign that you put at the front of the lane into the farm, and there's not many farms that make it 100 years. So
yes, and it fits with what we're saying on these businesses. Yep. And it was just so impressive to me. It was so much about personal mastery, personal development, and development of the self in relation to the people around you, and then to the community and your role in that. And then how, through practicing these different disciplines, including what we're talking about, embracing this idea of change, and how you keep there on the edge, you keep embracing that and working with that, and how the best run companies that became institutionalized, those disciplines and their ability to interact with one another in creative, very creative ways. I'm thinking now, he talks about the importance of dialogue, which is the exchange of ideas, not trying to make decisions at that point, but the importance of dialogue in terms of with people of different backgrounds, of acknowledging, well, what's happening economically, socially, ecologically in the landscape, in our business landscape, and how do we keep abreast of that, and how do we keep a step ahead of that? It was fabulous stuff. I used to, I was in a college of natural resources, and people there weren't running businesses, but I had, in the classes I taught, people read some of the chapters from that book, because they were so much in the end about ever-changing environments, ecology, economics, sociology, and what it takes really for any of us to stay in the game and stay engaged, and I think as much as anything to enjoy it, to enjoy the journey. So it becomes something fun and interesting and challenging, and looking at opportunities, and the best run businesses, they certainly do that. And they aren't just myopically focused on their own little universe. They're thinking about what's going on around them, socially, economically, ecologically, and how they can embrace that and work with that to the betterment of their business and the people who are involved with them in the business.
Like, I think what you're saying is, it's not just embracing change, but it's embracing complexity, right? Like, think agriculture, tremendously complex, like all those disciplines you mentioned, it is very, very highly complex. And of course, that's what makes it so interesting as well. And like, to me, what I see is the farms that are doing well is their aim is always for constantly a deeper understanding of how to do this thing called agriculture.
Absolutely the case, absolutely. And so he's got these 5 disciplines, and I'm sitting here trying to remember what all of them were.
Oh, that's not.
And they're like personal mastery, building shared vision, team learning, those sort of things. But the 5th discipline is exactly what you say. That's developing a systems view of the world, thinking of the world as something as complex, ever-changing, dynamic system, and having a systems view rather than a linear, deterministic view of life. You start to embrace and develop what it means to think of the world as this complex, creative, dynamic system. And so he spends an awful lot of time in the book just trying to acquaint people with what does it mean to think in a systems way. So it's exactly what you're talking about, Michael. Absolutely that. Okay, let me perfect kind of discussion, at least from my standpoint, to take us a little bit further into what this slide here. Let's talk about civilizations now. And you know, when I was writing Nourishment, I came across this book. A friend sent it to me, A Moderate Greatness: Why Civilizations Fail by William Offless. It's a very short book. Actually, if a person's a little bit of a quick reader, you could read it in a night. And what he does is to summarize the works of many, many people related to what causes civilizations to fail. You know, Michael, I don't know if you recall this or not, but you sent me a link to a paper and a talk by a Canadian who was looking down south at these ununited states of America nowadays. And he was talking just exactly about this, the rise and fall of civilizations. And his thought was that we are a civilization that's in the last stage. Well, when you look at the average lifetime of civilization, it's not that long. I mean, I was taught when I was growing up about the Roman Empire and some of the Chinese dynasties that lasted going on 1,000 years or more, but that's unusual. That's very, very unusual. Most civilizations survived for about 10 generations, or roughly 250 years, as they evolved through 5 stages. And you know, when I was reading the book, it's just, you can just think about your own country and these different stages, from pioneers, the pioneering people with enterprise and initiative and hard work. And then that leads to commerce and commercial prowess, and then to affluence for the people in the society, for many of the people in the society. And then you get to this age of intellect where quantity trumps quality. And I often think that about science nowadays, and it's not to be some big judge and critic, but you know, you think of what are the really new and interesting ideas, not just kind of redoing the same old things. And I think a lot of it's just saying the same old things in different ways. And then you have this stage of decadence where from politicians to people on the street, it's corrupt, it's unjust. And you know, the article you sent me by his name is slipping me, Michael. You can make, that was a great article.
Yeah, sorry, I can't remember it off the top of my head either. But
no,
anthropologist out of UBC, Wade Davis is his name.
Wade Davis. He's well known. I didn't
very well
realize. You know, no, but he's really talking about that and talking about issues. You know, he's thinking about the United States and talking about the U.S. But you know, it just comes alive reading what he wrote and reading this book, A Moderate Greatness. So, and you think about, well, where is the U.S. nowadays? And we've certainly gone through those stages. Depending which way you want to look at it, I guess you could certainly see we're at this intellect and decadence kind of stage, affluence, intellect and decadence. And I guess we'll see what happens. But one of the things that's interesting about the book, there's 2 things. One is he talks about, you know, you reach limits. Civilizations reach limits. There's a carrying capacity, we could say, in a way, to relate it back to livestock and landscapes. There's a carrying capacity for everything. And, you know, it would relate to the ecological facets of these things. There's a carrying capacity for people on this planet. And so that gets talked about in the book, our use of resources. And then that links, of course, with the economic facets of things. And we're going to talk about as we go along our utter dependence on fossil fuels and how, you know, economics does focus on land, labor, and capital. And yet it ignores the fundamentally most important thing of all that's driven what's happened to us in the last couple hundred years. And that's the availability of very inexpensive fossil fuels. And that's not likely to continue. And again, Michael, you shared a wonderful article with me that as we go along here, we want to get into that in that first, in fact, in the next segment. We want to talk about our utter dependence on fossil fuels and the implications of that for where we're headed as a society. And of course, that links socially. So ecological, economic, and social issues are all one and the same in very real sense. And in the book, he talks about these biophysical limits that we reach ecologically, economically, socially. And the human error that's egos and error and the part of the human nature. And that's, again, going back to Peter Senge's book, one of the disciplines has to do with self-mastery, how important that is, the decency and integrity of human beings in helping to avoid practical failures and moral decays. And then we finally get overcome with excessive complexity, not only biophysical limits, but there's limits to what human can wrap their head around, I guess, just this levels of complexity. I often think that when I think about the Congress of the United States nowadays, they seem so, they're so polarized. In the country nowadays, the president mandates primarily through executive orders because the Congress is so polarized, they literally cannot deal with anything. So you get this, using that as just an example of this excessive complexity overwhelms people in the system, and all those things come together to ultimately cause the demise of a civilization. They crack all in different ways and come apart in different ways, but they end up the same place. Well, historically, the consequences of a failed civilization were catastrophic for a particular local society and its inhabitants, but they weren't fatal to the whole species. And I think now that's something that many people, I think, including old people like me, I wonder that a lot. I think that we're one people on one tiny, tiny little orb, beautiful orb, but we're linked ecologically, economically, and socially, whether we're in China or Russia or Europe or the United States or Canada or South America. We really are linked. And I think this pandemic is an example, whether a person, some people don't believe it's real, some believe it's real, whatever it is, but for sure, it's had a global impact. Climate change is another one that certainly, it knows these things know no boundaries. And I think back to the global recession in 2008 or whenever it was, how, man, every country around the world was affected by that. So we are one peoples in a sense, but the question is, can today's societies become more intricately coupled with one another in the landscapes we inhabit? I think, can we learn the value of curbing human wants? Do people have the managerial capacity to sustain such a system? As we go on, all of the topics will tie in with these kind of questions. And then when we hit that last session on transformations, it so much has to do with our consciousness, the way we view one another and our relationship with one another and our relationship with the landscapes we inhabit. I think that's going to be the key to what happens on this planet. And I guess the answers to these questions are a mystery that time will reveal to us. Any thoughts there, Michael, that you want to add on? That's the civilization part of this spiel, basically.
No, this is, of course, very interesting to me, and we've talked a little bit about this in phone conversations and such. And when we talk about limits, a lot of what happens when civilizations fail, as best as we can understand it, is we reach our cognitive limit, our ability to understand what is actually happening. And that's one theory of how things collapse, is we've kind of reached our cognitive limit. And instead of doing the hard work to have a deeper understanding, we kind of descend into, beliefs or mythologies or things like that. And that sort of leads us down a road where, beliefs become more important than facts. And So that's, that's just a comment on that. And Joseph Tainter wrote a wonderful book called, I think, Collapse of Complex Civilizations. And that was his thesis, is that complexity increases, right? At some point, it's just, there's more complexity than the system can handle. You're using more energy than can be, sustainably done. And that leads to collapse too. So, there's interesting analogies that you can kind of take back to agriculture and the amount of energy we're currently using. And maybe we'll talk about that more in the next presentation when we talk about fossil fuels. But, as things become more and more complex, that does have an energy cost. And, at some point, the ability to maintain that complexity becomes too much.
That's absolutely the case. And this excessive complexity here at the bottom, that Joseph Tainter's book is exactly what I was thinking about. He became department head at Utah State during the last years that I was there at Utah State. And yeah, he'd done some fabulous work in thinking about those kind of issues, huh?
Right.
Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so good point. This thing, okay, so it's also the case that plant and animal species have lifetimes. And I remember the first time someone challenged me to think about that. It was during a lecture by this preeminent fellow, and he just was mentioning that, the average lifetime of a species is a few million years. And I honestly had never really thought about that before, but that's certainly the case. And paleontologists tell us that 99% of the species that have lived on this planet are now extinct. And, the estimates range, obviously, from, 8.7 billion to trillions of species. But the key point is that, so let's say there were 8.7 billion species that have been on this planet. Virtually all of them are gone now. So it gets you thinking about, it gets me anyway, thinking about the dynamism of this planet and how, what a beautiful planet it is. I think it's amazing. And to think about how transient everything is, how fleeting everything is. And throughout their lifetimes, these plants and animals move about the planet as climates change. And this book, After the Ice Age, The Return of Life to Glaciated North America, was written by a Canadian author and an ecologist who did absolutely fabulous work throughout her career. Her name's E.C. Pellew, and I learned about her early on in my graduate career, taking a class. And I could really relate to the kind of things that she studied. She was very much interested in the dynamism of plant communities and how they move about. And so this book is really about what happened after the glaciation. Roughly, glaciers have, most of the life of Earth, glaciers have covered this planet. And roughly 20,000 years ago was the end of the last glaciation. And what she does is to document how plants and animals both moved about after that glaciation. And if you ever have rigid views of native plant species, of what's native and what's not, that'll get you thinking about that. Really, plants and animals are constantly moving around. Not only are the continents moving on the planet, moving around, but plant and animal species are moving around on those continents. And in the discipline that I worked in so much, in ecology and in range science and so forth, we really tried to figure out what are native species and how do native communities work. And I think there's certainly value in that, and that'll be brought into discussions, when it comes to how do we farm and ranch in ways that in ways that mimic nature and natural processes. We'll bring that in. But so that was the upside. But the downside was, I think we were always looking at how did things used to be? How were they? How, You know, what were the native plants? What were the native animals? And then we try to, at great effort, try to figure out, and no need to go into all the details of how you do that, but you know, what used to be here, like on that landscape right there that's in the picture. What's the native species? But what struck me after long enough of that was that, you know, we interpret snapshots of times past as, quote, the way things always were and always should be. And what we forget is we're just taking a photograph of a moving target. It's forever changing. I used to tease my colleagues at Utah State. I'd say, you know, if we'd been here when species now native were invading, what would we have done? And they'd get a smile on their face because we try to get rid of them. We try to, they're weeds, they're invasive species. So I used to say, well, yesterday's invasive species are today's new natives and tomorrow's relics. What we need to do is figure out how to use those things. And we'll talk about that as we go along. So things never were the way they were, and they never will be again. Endless creativity in the physical universe, I think, is real. It is a creative universe, I would argue, but that comes at a cost. The price of admission is endless transformation. So this notion then, from death comes life and endless transformation, and goes back to the quote that you gave at the beginning, Michael, about eating is participating in endless transformation, basically. And, you know, there's a galaxy there that's shown. You know, I watched a fabulous Nova special a couple of years ago on black holes and galaxies. And I learned that at the center of each galaxy is a black hole that's in the process of consuming the galaxy. It's literally eating the galaxy up. The sun, it's burning itself up. Bears are eating fish, are eating plankton, are eating, and so forth and so on. This whole idea that the universe is ever in the process of consuming itself, basically, this endless transformation. So I used to like to put this in, that's where we are, basically, in the process of we're being consumed, how we're consuming and being consumed at the same time. I often think, and we'll come back to this in that last section on transformation, about I am, you know, without beginning or end. That's so hard, I think, to wrap one's head around. No beginning, no end. I can neither be created nor destroyed. I change forms endlessly. A life, a civilization, a species, a universe, ever-changing verses than the language of I am. The origins of I am, for us puny humans anyway, beyond all categories of thought. It's a deep mystery that we're participating in here on this planet. So energy and matter change forms endlessly, as Einstein taught us. Matter is energy. Energy is matter. We know here, and we'll talk about this in terms of plants, solar energy arrives on Earth, becomes matter in the forms of green leaves, the plants, creating the food we eat that fuels our thoughts. As Richard Feynman said, what is this mind of ours? What are these atoms with consciousness? Last week's potatoes. So when my father was near the end of his life, sometimes we would visit, but sometimes he would reflect back to when we were young kids and different things that had happened. And he used to say, it's like a dream. It's like I dreamed it. It's not like it was never happened. It was like a dream. And now I'm in the 70s and kind of think the same thing, you know. And the sutras, they say, all compounded things are impermanent, like a star, an optical illusion, or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop, or a bubble. Like a dream, a flash of lightning, or a cloud. So should one consider all compounded things. We're here the blink of an eye, and then we're gone. As Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, if you realize that all things change, there's nothing you will try to hold on to. That's a challenge. I think that all the time. I have to work at that a lot. If you aren't afraid of dying, there's nothing you can't achieve. Again, we'll come back to this at the end, and these ideas of enlightenment and what that means. He also says trying to control the future is like trying to take the master carpenter's place. When you handle the master carpenter's tools, chances are that you'll cut yourself. I think about that quite a lot in terms of different ways, farming practices that we use. And I'm not trying to be the judge or anything. You know, the Green Revolution and the people that started the Green Revolution and industrial ag and fertilizers and herbicides and pests, they did that out of the very best intentions. They were thinking about how do we feed people. And so I'm not here to judge in any way, but we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about that in relation to regenerative ag and some of the principles that are coming out in there that are much more, I think, trying to align themselves with how do the processes of nature work? What does it mean to have a living soil and diversity of plant species and animals, for the animals that are on those landscapes with healthy soils and diverse plant species, and what does that mean for us? And so I think of that when I think about this, trying to control the future is like trying to take the master carpenter's place. If we would think of nature as the master carpenter, then we would probably do well to think about how do the processes of nature work, and how can we work with those processes rather than against them? And then what does that mean in terms of the bottom line? You know, I think I'm thinking ahead to the next section where, you know, many of the things that plants have done and soils have done historically, we usurped. We took those things that plants were doing naturally away, and now we're trying to make up for that with great expense with fossil fuels. So that may sound vague at this point, but it's trying to say that some of the things we've done, taking the master carpenter's tools into our hands, we probably have cut ourselves, and maybe it's worth a think now about, as much as we can understand it, how do natural processes work, and then what ways can we use those processes to the benefit of everyone on the planet, ecologically, economically, and socially.
Yeah, I would add something there. Like Fred, you mentioned like regenerative ag, and the way I think about it, you know, many have asked, you know, what is regenerative ag? How do you define it? And I would just define it sort of exactly how you were just talking about it. Is it's basically understanding the laws of nature and applying it to agriculture, right? And
yes,
so when we do things like, and again, you know, no judgment, it's just, again, just try to, you know, deeper understanding of, say, some of the consequences of perfectly noble ends trying to feed everybody, because that's been sort of a historical struggle for humans. So, of course, that's going to be a project, but you know, one of the consequences of that is, like, say, for example, fertilizer, you're hijacking, and that's a word that you use in, you know, one of the themes is the word hijack. We're hijacking that process where the plant and the soil are doing those things to make nutrients available to, and you hijack it by adding in, you know, an external, like, say you've now taken what was like a circle or a process, a cycle, right? And you've turned it into a straight line, a pipe, a linear understanding, right? Nitrogen in one end, yield out the other. But what are maybe some of the consequences of that over time?
Absolutely the case, Michael. Absolutely the case. I was trying to go back to this earlier slide, and I messed things up. But no, that's absolutely the case. And you know, and I think trying to have a humility in all of that, even with the regenerative ag movement, and realizing it seems like when you look back, you know, life's kind of an unending series of unintended consequences. Huh? We try the best we can, but we end up with these consequences that we never really anticipated. Huh? So with the humility, but trying our best, huh? And that's certainly how I would see
exactly.
Regenerative ag nowadays, huh? As a way to try to,
because we're just sort of on, you know, at the beginning of this process, this new idea of regenerative ag is that there's still so much to learn.
Absolutely. And that's where I'm so enthusiastic about being able to spend time with you and just have this discussion where we'll go over this series. It's just going to be a wonderful chance for us to do what we're doing today, to put ideas out there and discuss them, huh? So I would say then, yet we, at least in many of the things that I've seen, we resist change by declaring wars and fighting battles against anything that threatens constancy under the guise of, quote, saving the world. And, we try our best, right? The war to end all wars, the war on cancer, the war on climate, the war on invasive species. Rather than go into depth on each one of these, which I do in a longer series that I do, but let's just talk about invasive species just a second to make some points that we'll come to as we go along in the discussion. I think, to declare war on something, you focus on that, then myopically as the enemy, it becomes the enemy. And in a way, we ignore the interdependent and ever-changing nature then of what's happening on the planet. I often think too, and again, we can talk more about this as we go along, and I'm not wanting to be judgmental, but in the end, there's probably nothing to save, just the self, this ego grasping for power, control, and permanence in a universe of impermanence, actually. So it has to do with these broader ideas that we were talking about related to the individual and the development of the individual and how the individual then relates to the world, to the natural communities that we inhabit, including people and the plants and animals in those. As I mentioned earlier, so much of what I was involved in over the years in ecology and in wildlife biology and range science, we were really enamored with native species and pristine places. And, the beauty of those, I think for those of us who got involved in that, that was what drew us into those fields, was our love of nature and natural systems and thinking of the beauty of those and this idea of, what is native and what's pristine. And as I was mentioning earlier, in a way, though, that ignores this notion of change, and that what you're looking at one point in time, come back in 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, won't be anywhere near the same as it was. So this idea of change, and that certainly relates to this war on invasive species. When I was writing the book, I was reviewing articles, and they were pointing out there's like 50,000 species, invasive species around the globe, rising in the US. We spend $120 billion a year trying to get rid of invasive species in the US with very little success. What we've done actually is to select for herbicide-resistant plant species, and the USA has more than any other country on the planet with the approaches that we've taken. And again, we'll talk about this as we go along, getting into that next section. But I think one of the real challenges is, rather than to see them as something invasive, to think about how can we turn weeds into resources. Okay, there's plant, like in this is that view of cattle there in the upper left slide, this one. That's on a ranch, a 7,000 acre ranch in eastern Montana that Ray Bannister has won many awards over the years for managing that place. And we worked with Ray quite a lot over the years. He was concerned about invasive species like leafy spurge and increasers like sagebrush and snowberry and so forth. And we talked a lot about ways to manage grazing so that you can reduce the abundance of those plant species. And that got into a lot of details about time and timing and complementarities and a whole bunch of different things. But there are ways that you can turn weeds into resources. We did a lot of work in the Great Basin with this plant species here, sagebrush, and thinking about how to turn that from something that people spend thousands and thousands of dollars trying to get rid of into a forage resource by the time that it's used and how it's used. And we showed successfully with sheep and cattle both that that sagebrush could become an asset, not a liability. And in the process of turning it into an asset, could also increase the biodiversity of plant and animal species on the landscape. I work with people in France and have for many years now, and they've done fabulous work on herding and herding techniques, to where we'll talk about this in the next section, where they have different courses to meals, and by the way that they align those different courses, the appetizer phases, the main courses, the boosters, the desserts, and so forth, which may sound goofy, but it's not at all. And their nuanced understanding of behavior and how to have animals utilize all these different plant species, not only for the benefit of the livestock producers, but for the benefit of those landscapes, so that they don't become just monocultures of species you don't like. It's amazing. So I think there again, do we look at weeds as something that we want to try to declare war on, and at great expense with herbicides and so forth, try to get rid of them, which basically creates they're a step ahead of us all the way? Or do we start thinking about how can we embrace this? This is an interesting challenge and opportunity. How can we do that? That's the flavor, I think, that Michael and I are trying to paint here today.
Yep.
So go ahead, Michael. Do you want to?
No, that's excellent. What you're saying is really trying to turn what is a weed, in a negative sense, into a resource, using the livestock as a tool to improve the landscape, right? It's positive.
Absolutely.
Instead of fighting against, you're working with.
That's absolutely, and embracing that. And again, that, not to sound like broken records, but you're embracing that change. You're recognizing that that's a part of how systems work, and then thinking about, okay, animals aren't machines, genes aren't destiny. And these are topics that, again, we'll be getting into, but thinking about how do we flow with this thing? We can't fight it. It's probably foolish to even try, and frustrating. It's like trying to teach a pig to fly, as they say, frustrates the pig, and you too. It's not going to get you anywhere. So how do we go with it? That's absolutely the case, and that's the last part here then. So creatures do transform as environments change. They do that. And, so much of our work over the 40 years was really trying to understand that. How do creatures transform? And, historically, in evolutionary biology and Darwinian kind of thought, and I'm not meaning to be negative here either, but the focus is species change as genes with survival value are passed to the next generation. And people who work with livestock are familiar with that concept. That's certainly what we do. We select for genetics that we want on our place. And if you think about that across all species and across eons, that's the idea, is that environments are selecting sort of animal. I've heard this said that species propose and nature disposes. If you're not fit, you're not going to make it. And certainly there's a truth to that. But what I want to emphasize as we go along is this: organisms aren't just machines. And I know, depending on who would be listening to this, some of the evolutionary folks would annihilate me, but I don't buy it. I think after a lifetime of watching creatures, they create relationships with what they deem are the relevant facets of the social and biophysical worlds they inhabit. They're interacting, they're participating, and they're co-evolving with those landscapes. A friend in Australia sent me a really nice paper recently. I should share it with you, Michael, too. Sure. That's about this, and these ideas that creatures are involved in this relationship. So it's participatory. And I've got a little thing here that I want to show you. That let's see if we can get this to play. You know, somehow when I get in this presenter view.
Oh yeah, maybe turn that off, the pointer.
Yeah, I need to turn it off because let's see, how do I turn it off?
Just click on laser pointer again and
Okay.
turn it off.
Thank you.
There
Yeah, I'm having trouble advancing. Okay, so let's look at this thing here. So for people watching this, you know, you may guess where that's going to end, but you know, think of this oyster catcher here, and how did that bird come up with that? How did that bird learn to fish? Throughout my career, I saw domestic animals, quote, learning to fish in some most interesting ways, and individuals doing things that then other individuals learn from. And you think, you know, this is amazing. And this behavior that gets learned by an animal, figured out, then it can spread to other animals in the group and it can become a part of the culture. All these kind of things we'll talk about. But it really made me stop to think about animals are participating in their environments, plants and animals both. And we'll try to make that point in the next thing. Plants can't get up and run away, but my goodness. And in that paper that I sent you, We Are the Earth is Us, there's a whole section, the Heartscape section, that talks about plants and the sentience and consciousness of plants and their participation in the environment. We'll make that come alive in the next section. And they do that in part through this vast array of these phytochemicals, all these compounds they produce. Those become the eyes, the ears, the taste, the 20 senses of plants are expressed in many ways through these compounds and as they interact with the environment. So I see this as creatures really are participating in their environments. And it's not just human beings. So nature fills vacuums with individuals then, and no two are alike. We often say that nature abhors a vacuum. I think what nature abhors is sameness. And on this slide here, it's a little hard to see, but this is from a wonderful book, The Triple Helix, which Richard Lewontin wrote near the end of his life. And the book has very much this flavor of participation. He and I don't like the name adaptation because it gives this very passive kind of view. Animals aren't just adapting, they're participating, they're creating. And in that book, he talks about different views. And so here would be the view that genes are all that matters in creating organisms. This would be the environment view, and then the gene-environment interaction. And you know, certainly that is what's happening. Genes are interacting with environments, and you get this much greater diversity of organisms that can be created. More about that in a minute. But then you also have what he calls noisy development or chance. And chance is playing a role at a developmental level during conception. We'll talk about the experiences in utero and early in life, but during conception and during those months in the womb, during development, chance is playing a role in how development of these different organ systems, from the central nervous system to the liver to the microbiomes to you name it. chances playing a role at a micro level during development. And that's what creates this tremendous, tremendous, tremendous diversity. You know, you can realize, and it's amazing to think this, that no two species on this planet have ever been, no two individuals, not species, no two individuals on this planet have ever been alike. And that, of course, is related very much to Roger Williams' book, and he wrote this 50, 60 years ago. This is an updated version, but it's titled Biochemical Individuality, the Key to Understanding What Shapes Your Health. And it's maybe not the most interesting book to read, but it's the book I would recommend that documents more than any other book I've ever read how different we are biochemically in terms of function and in terms of form. No two creatures are alike on this, have been on this planet. So he talks about that, and realize this was 60 some years ago he wrote this book. He talks about that in relation, or maybe even 80 years ago. He talks about that, though, in relation to where medicine and nutrition would probably go. He said, from a medicine standpoint, it means that you can't prescribe one thing for everyone. Every individual is so different. And I often think of that. My wife and I don't watch TV much at all, but when we do, you're overwhelmed by all the ads by the pharmaceutical company, which we will talk about as we go along too. And what strikes me is how long it takes them to tell all the side effects. This might happen to you, that might happen to you, something else might happen to you. What that's reflecting is that no two creatures are alike, and there's all these possible side effects depending upon how your body's built and how it functions. Roger also talked about that in terms of nutritional wisdom, which we'll talk a great deal more about. And he makes a point, and it's interesting to me because I've had conversations with people, one in the UK, another one here in the United States recently, where they were coming to the same conclusion. They say, well, if what you say is right regarding nutritional wisdom, then there's no need for these recommendations that come out of the federal government here in the US, the Department of Agriculture and so forth, the My Plate kind of stuff. There's no need. If you're eating in proper ways, your body knows what you need. And that's the conclusion that Roger Williams came to years ago. He said, if this wisdom were universally possessed by all members of the human family, there'd be no need to study nutrition, and the only deficiency diseases would be those induced when suitable foods weren't available. We'll talk much more about that as we go along, but this whole idea that each person's body is unique, and what a person needs to nourish their body becomes unique to that person. So other people can't tell you and shouldn't be telling you what you need. But then this whole challenge, and that gets to this hijacking the system. How does the system get hijacked? That's where the confusion lies, and that's where we'll get into that in one of the later episodes about how this wisdom gets hijacked, and then how can we get back in tune with the wisdom of our own body, both in a physical and a spiritual sense. Actually, you know, that wisdom lies within each of us. So we mentioned this notion of epigenetics. Or maybe we didn't. We mentioned that genes are being expressed in the environment, and we'll talk more about this idea of epigenetics, but just to introduce the idea here. So we have these genes that are really fixed, they're stable. But what wasn't appreciated historically is that these genes are being expressed as a function of the environment, and that starts at conception. And it's the social and the physical environment. And so, you know, genes, what gets expressed, and then how that affects form and function and ability to be in a particular environment and to thrive in that environment. That's such an interesting and important area. And we'll talk a great deal about that. But epigenetics then is heritable changes in gene expression caused by mechanisms other than changes in the DNA sequence. So we're not talking Darwin anymore, we're talking gene expression. And within these ever-changing environments. And that's what allows creatures, if you live on this earth for, say, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million years, there's a tremendous, tremendous amount of change that occurs during that time. Well, the genome isn't changing. The individual, a wolf is a wolf is a wolf, an elk is an elk, and so forth and so on. A caribou is a caribou. What's changing is the expression of those genes and the ability to adapt. And then there's a cultural part of that we're going to want to talk about as well. So all that amounts to then is that we should take our views of genetics, if you're animal science or plant scientist, or evolution, beyond how organisms develop from earlier forms to include changes occurring within the lifetime of the individual. And that is to say, individuals are involved in the world, which is what allows them to evolve with the world. One last thought here then is this idea of the relationship between science and art and principles and processes. As I mentioned earlier, in the 40 years that I was involved in research, we were so focused on trying to understand principles and processes, because the idea was that if we could understand how things work, then that would have so many implications for practical kinds of things, what we could do. People I worked with, and me included, came from ranch backgrounds. We'd spent a lot of time working with animals and plants and crops, growing crops, raising animals, sheep, cattle, pigs in my case, chickens, alfalfa, grains, but we thought what can really be of most help is to understand principles and processes. So that's the science as we looked at it. And then we thought there's an art part to this. There's an art part to the science, actually, of how you do that. But there's an artistic part, too, of how people paint the landscape then. Because when it gets down to it, each person, each manager of land, each farmer, each rancher is an artist. And they're painting a canvas, and that canvas is unique in time and space and unique to them and the way that they want to paint that. That's the creativity and the beauty that's in that. And so I think understanding principles and processes, and then their manifestations. There are all these manifestations that come out of that in time and space as climate, soil, plants, herbivores, people continually transform. So in practice, then, managers evolve. They must evolve, as we were talking earlier about Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline. Evolve with prevailing ecological, economic, and social conditions. And one important way to do that, I think, is link understanding of processes of nature with the flexibility to respond to these ever-changing environments. And as we go along, then, it'll be these kind of dynamics, soils and plant diversity and animals, herbivores, humans, climate, and so forth. That's the dynamic that we'll discuss as we go along in this presentation. And with that, Michael, that's kind of an overview that you and I have been discussing on this idea of change, and hopefully that makes some sense in relation to why it's important to start off thinking about change as the only constant and not seeing that as something negative, but seeing that as something that is a challenge for us to embrace and creates opportunities for us to paint landscapes and to be creative as we go along.
Yeah, that's a great start. And of course, we're going to flesh out a lot of these themes in more detail, but I like what you're saying. Like, to me, the exciting part with these new ideas that are emerging in agriculture is the opportunity to be creative and to use our imagination to solve some of the issues that we have to try to feed the world and do all the things that we need to do. But once you start to open your mind to some of these new ideas, it's just like it's just so exciting and motivating and inspirational, and you've done a nice job to sort of give us an overview for part one. Maybe as a summary, just to try to make it practical, like I was saying, I want to be able to give producers something in every episode here to sort of take and when they're done watching the video and rush out and change their farm and make it better, right? And sort of understanding what we were talking about, change and transformation, if that's really the sort of the foundational fundamental rule of nature, and it appears that that is correct, how do we, in the real world here, where bills need to get paid and change is fearful and can cause stress and anxiety, how do we embrace that and still pay the bills? What would be some of your comments on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a huge question, I think, Michael. Actually,
Yeah,
a very, very good one and a huge one. When I was at Utah State University, during the last 10 years I was there, we had a program called Behave, and we were working with people around the country, actually around the world, trying to take these ideas about behavioral principles and processes and change and adaptation, and think about how people can implement those. And there was a large group of us. It started out with about 45 people from around the country. By the time, at the end of 10 years, there were like 250 people that were involved, and we'd meet once a year. And we were all trying to think about your question and how can we, the idea was, how can we work with natural processes to be least cost producers, basically. The idea was that if we can embrace natural ways, that's going to be a least cost way to operate in the environments. And so we would talk about that. We would, as the program went along, people would be giving presentations on what they were doing. And we were constantly talking about, if you're going to implement a change, what's the best way to do that? And this idea of the adaptation trough, that, okay, you want to, there's good reasons ecologically, economically, and socially to make a change. We've gotten to that point. But we know that change can be costly because the system has to adapt, from the soils to the plants, to the animals, to the humans. Everything in that system is going to have to adapt. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the adaptation trough, and this three-year trough, often for plants and animals anyway. And I think it's true for humans too. It's like a minimum of 3 years to get through that trough. The first year is traumatic. The next year you get a little better. By the third year, and we showed that over and over again in the studies we were doing, and with ranchers that we were working with, that, when we made major changes, it would take livestock 3 years to make that change. And I was reading about soils. That was before soils were the big topic that they are now. But I was reading about soils, and they're saying, when you switch from inorganic to organic, it's like 3 years for the life in those soils to make changes. So I know I'm not directly answering your question, but I think it is the question. And, what we were doing was trying to help one another through that trough, taking the knowledge of all the people that were in that Behave group. And here I'm not talking just scientists. I'm talking a lot of people from that, farmers and ranchers that were in that group, that were the majority of the group. And we were brainstorming about, ways, and we became a support system for one another. So it was a very interactive kind of thing where in who liked what we were, like what we're talking about here today, and thought there was value, in ways over and over again, focusing on what does it mean to be locally adapted to the landscapes we inhabit? What does that mean to be working with nature? And then how can we do that? What are the ways that we can change? So it was like a series of processes that we were going through. First, to try to understand what are these processes and how are they working, and then to think about, well, what does that mean for how we're producing food and the economics of producing food, and then thinking about, well, these are ways that we can really reduce costs. We can reduce costs in our in the system. And then, okay, but to do that, we're going to have to change, because the animals are used to being fed all winter long hay. Now we're not going to feed them anymore, but we know if we just cold turkey them, just to try to throw a quick, and so we were working, I don't know, probably your producers will know people like Kit Farrow. We were working with Kit over the years, and his idea of that absolutely meshed with what we were talking about, of how you create animals that are locally adapted to the landscapes, that are, you're not working for them, they're out there working for the system and everyone involved. And all that we were learning, and it goes way beyond genetics. Certainly having the right genetics, and of course kids selling genetics, right? And I'm good friends with kids, I'm not, but it's also your epigenetics and all these learned things that we're going to talk about, these social, cultural kind of things that are going on with animals, and we could say with the plants too, in a sense. But all that would be playing into changes then that people would make on their properties, with the idea that, hey, I can cut costs. I can really cut costs. But as we go along, we just worked with so many different people, with sheep, with cattle, with bison. We did a lot of work with bison, still doing some work with bison. And, as we go along, Michael, too, some of the nuts and bolts of that and what we used to do, we may want to bring a bit more of that than I have right now in the slides that I've prepared. Into the conversation, as in the 12 years since I've retired, I've gotten way far more involved in the human food part of things, and our diets, and how soil and plant diversity links with sheep and cattle nutrition and health, links with healthy meat and dairy for us. But we did so much work on the nuts and bolts of change and how to enact change on a landscape level, that we may want to include more of that than what I have. We can look at that as we go.
We can talk.
Also thinking, we produced a booklet. We produced many fact sheets, videos, outreach kind of materials during those 10 years of Behave. But there was a booklet we put together titled Foraging Behavior, Managing to Survive in a World of Change. And it was that weaving of real world people with principle and process. And we had that, and we also had a video. I've got a PDF that I can send you of that foraging behavior that, again, you could share with people. But from the Bob Budds who changed habitat selection in their animals, to the A.G. Smith, the A.G.'s who got cattle to eat sagebrush, to the Ray Bannisters, and on and on and on. We featured them in that booklet and the changes that they made as we went along with that program. But it was like it was a comprehensive kind of thing. And we used to say in that group, we're all students. We're all students, to keep us in that, hopefully, that humble posture. We're all students. We're all trying to understand processes of nature and how we can work with those processes. And it was the best 10 years. And I loved every year at Utah State. I loved what I did there the whole time. But that last 10 years was just, there couldn't have been a better way to pull everything together than working with real live farmers, ranchers, to take what we've been learning and develop that further, and then to try to think about how to put it in and put it into practice. Not just think about it, but work with people, and all of us working together. That's where the strength lies, I think, is in people that get on board with this and then co-creating. one mind is not good compared to 10 minds or 20 minds, huh? All thinking and working together. That was the spirit and the flavor, and it was just that made it hard to leave Utah State, actually. But it was time to go when when it was time to go for me. But
I think
that was
you do make an important point. I think if you're thinking about going down this road as a producer and making some changes, you need to have that group of like minds. That's what's really going to help you get through because there'll still be hard times. Like none of this is going to suddenly create a perfect world. Farming is still hard. If you think about the humility of it, it's farming's a 10,000-year-old problem, and we're still trying to figure out the solution, right? So we still, like I say, have much to learn, and so humility is important. But yeah, you need that group of people that you can talk to and learn from and share and grow and all that good stuff. So with that, I think that's maybe a good place to end off today's webinar, and I'll get this posted online, and then we'll plan to do another one perhaps every week through the winter, and we'll get them all posted. And so I thank you very much.
That sounds great to me, Michael. Thank you very much too for the chance to for the opportunity, the wonderful opportunity to do this with you. And maybe that's what we should do, is think about one a week, and we can kind of as we go along, some of the questions you're raising and some of the things, maybe we can both of us take a look at the material and say, maybe we should add this here or that there that may or may not be in what I've put together so far. You know what I mean? We'll kind of, we'll try to be continually evolving.
Changes, endless transformations.
Right, practice what we're talking about here, because
I like that.
that'll be perfect.